The bright morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Capitol building as Elon Musk stepped out into the crisp Washington, D.C. air. His shoulders felt heavy after 3 days of back-to-back meetings with lawmakers, each one more draining than the last. Running his fingers through his slightly messy hair, he checked his phone. 5 missed calls from Tesla's board and a dozen urgent emails about SpaceX's latest launch preparations. Just then, an elderly street vendor caught his eye. The man was wearing a bright red MAGA hat and selling hot dogs from his cart, cheerfully chatting with every customer regardless of their political leanings. Something about the vendor's genuine smile and warm demeanor made Musk pause. As he approached to buy a hot dog, the vendor recognized him instantly. "Well, if it isn't the Twitter boss himself," the vendor exclaimed, his eyes crinkling with delight. Before Musk could respond, the man pulled out a brand new MAGA hat from under his cart. "Here, a gift from an ordinary American who believes in innovation," he said, holding out the hat with weathered hands that spoke of decades of honest work. Musk found himself oddly touched by the simple gesture. As he held the hat, an idea began forming in his mind, one of those spontaneous experiments he was famous for. Instead of taking his usual private jet back to Texas, why not fly incognito? It would be a perfect chance to experience his own company's service as a regular passenger. He put on the hat, traded his designer jacket for a simple hoodie from his backpack, and messed up his hair a bit more. Looking at his reflection in his phone screen, he barely recognized himself. Perfect. He even booked the ticket under a common name, something that wouldn't raise any eyebrows. Walking through the airport, Musk felt a strange sense of freedom. Nobody gave him a second glance. He was just another face in the crowd. He couldn't remember the last time he felt so anonymous, so ordinary. The feeling was oddly refreshing, like taking off a heavy backpack after a long hike. As he approached the gate for his flight to Texas, he noticed a few raised eyebrows and whispered conversations about his hat. A young woman in business attire shot him a disapproving look, while an elderly gentleman gave him a subtle thumbs up. The mix of reactions only made him more curious about how the next few hours would unfold. Boarding the plane, Musk chose a seat in economy class, something he hadn't done in over a decade. He settled into the somewhat cramped space, his knees brushing against the seat in front of him. The familiar scent of airplane cabin air filled his nostrils as he watched other passengers board, some doing double takes at his hat before quickly averting their eyes. Little did these passengers know that the man they were judging, avoiding, or silently supporting was actually the owner of the very plane they were boarding. Musk pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, already thinking about how this social experiment might help him understand the day-to-day reality of his company's operations. What he didn't realize was that this simple decision to fly incognito was about to create one of the most memorable flights in his company's history. As the last passengers trickled in and the cabin crew began their pre-flight checks, Musk noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere that his hat was creating. Some passengers were whispering among themselves, others were purposefully avoiding looking in his direction, and a few were openly staring. The stage was set for what would become an unprecedented lesson in corporate leadership, human behavior, and the complex dynamics of political expression in public spaces. The flight attendant stood at her station, nervously adjusting her navy blue scarf as she watched the growing tension in the cabin. She was new to the job, just 3 months in, and this was exactly the kind of situation they'd warned about in training. But seeing it unfold in real time was something else entirely. It started with whispers. A group of passengers in row 12 kept glancing at the man in the MAGA hat, their disapproval evident in their hushed conversations. Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses, had already pressed her call button twice to complain about feeling uncomfortable. The flight attendant took a deep breath, remembering her training. She'd moved to America 5 years ago, worked her way through flight school, and landed this dream job. Now, watching the ripple effect of unease spread through the cabin, She felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. "Did you see what he's wearing?" She overheard a passenger whisper to his seatmate. "I can't believe they let people wear that kind of thing on planes anymore." The comment floated through the cabin, adding to the growing undercurrent of tension. A businessman in a crisp suit approached her near the galley. "Excuse me," he said in a low voice, "but several of us are concerned about that passenger." He nodded discreetly toward Musk. "In today's climate, it feels like a provocation. Surely there must be some policy about this." The flight attendant smiled professionally while her mind raced through the company handbook. There were policies about offensive clothing, but they were frustratingly vague. She glanced at the passenger in question. He seemed peaceful enough, just sitting there reading something on his phone. More passengers began to voice their concerns. A college student mentioned feeling triggered, while an elderly couple defended the passenger's right to wear what he wanted. The cabin was splitting into factions, and they hadn't even taken off yet. She decided to consult her supervisor, walking to the front of the plane where he was checking the passenger manifest. As she explained the situation, she couldn't help but notice how her hands were shaking slightly. This was the kind of moment that could define a career, handle it wrong, and it could end up all over social media. Her supervisor listened carefully, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. 20 years of flight experience had taught him that small issues could escalate quickly at 35,000 feet. He'd seen fights break out over less: a reclined seat, a crying baby, a snoring passenger. Together, they watched as more passengers began filming with their phones. The man in the hat seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around him, or perhaps he was choosing to ignore it. Either way, the situation was reaching a tipping point. "I'll handle this," her supervisor said finally, straightening his tie. "But stay close. If this goes sideways, we might need to delay takeoff." He started walking toward the passenger, each step measured and professional. The flight attendant hung back, watching the scene unfold. She noticed how other passengers had stopped their pre-flight routines, storing bags, adjusting seats, checking phones, to watch what was about to happen. The air felt thick with anticipation. What nobody on that plane realized was that they were all actors in an unplanned social experiment orchestrated by one of the world's most unpredictable billionaires. The next few minutes would not only change their lives, but would also spark a national conversation of freedom of expression, corporate policies, and the complex dance between personal rights and public comfort. As her supervisor approached the man in the MAGA hat, the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was about to happen. Little did she know, this routine flight was about to become one of the most talked about stories in aviation history. The head flight attendant walked down the aisle with the confidence of someone who'd handled countless difficult situations before. His shoes made soft sounds against the carpet as he approached the passenger in the MAGA hat, who was still casually scrolling through his phone. "Excuse me, sir," he said, keeping his voice low and professional. A few nearby passengers immediately pulled out their phones, ready to record whatever might happen next. "I need to have a word with you about your headwear." Musk looked up, his expression neutral. "Is there a problem?" he asked, deliberately keeping his voice gentle. He'd seen that look before, the carefully composed face of someone trying to handle a delicate situation. "Sir, we've received several complaints about your hat. While we respect personal choice, our policy asks that passengers avoid wearing items that might create a disruptive environment." The flight attendant's words were carefully chosen, rehearsed from years of dealing with tricky situations. A passenger 2 rows behind spoke up. "It's making people uncomfortable," she called out. Another voice from somewhere in the back added, "He has the right to wear what he wants." The cabin was quickly turning into a town hall meeting. Musk sat up straighter, noticing how the whole plane seemed to be holding its breath. "It's just a hat," he said calmly, "given to me by a kind stranger. I'm not trying to make any statements here." The flight attendant shifted his weight, aware that every eye in the cabin was on him. "Sir, I understand, but I must insist. We can provide you with a complimentary airline cap if you'd like." He gestured to his colleague to bring one forward. More phones were recording now. Someone in first class had even stood up to get a better view. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. "And if I choose not to remove it?" Musk asked, his hand discreetly reaching for his own phone in his pocket. He could feel his heart beating faster, not from fear or anger, but from genuine curiosity about how this would play out. The head flight attendant straightened his tie, a nervous habit he developed over years of service. "Then I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave the aircraft. We can rebook you on a later flight at no additional charge." A mix of cheers and boos erupted from different parts of the cabin. Someone shouted, "This is ridiculous," while another called out, "Good riddance." The flight attendant raised his hands, trying to calm the growing chaos. "Sir, what's your decision?" he asked, his professional demeanor starting to show cracks of stress. Behind him, the other flight attendants were positioned strategically in the aisles, ready to handle any escalation. Musk looked around the cabin, taking in the scene. Some passengers were shaking their heads in disapproval, others nodding in support. A few looked embarrassed by the whole situation. He saw fear, anger, satisfaction, and uncertainty painted across different faces. In that moment, he realized this experiment had already taught him more than he'd expected about human nature, corporate policies, and the delicate balance between individual rights and collective comfort. "Very well," Musk said, slowly standing up. "I'll leave." His calm response seemed to surprise everyone, especially those who had been recording, probably expecting a more dramatic confrontation. As he reached for his small carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, he could hear the rapid-fire clicking of phone cameras and the buzz of messages being sent. This story would be all over social media within minutes, though not for the reasons anyone currently imagined. The head flight attendant, still professional but visibly relieved, gestured toward the front of the plane. What he didn't know was that the biggest surprise of his career was just moments away. As Musk walked toward the front of the plane, his carry-on bag rolling quietly behind him, the atmosphere in the cabin was electric. Some passengers wore smug expressions, feeling they'd won a small victory. Others looked troubled, as if wondering whether this was really the right outcome. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why are they making that man leave?" he asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. The innocent question seemed to hang in the air, making several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The head flight attendant kept a respectful distance behind Musk, still unaware that he was escorting the owner of the airline off his own plane. His hands were slightly sweaty. These situations could turn ugly fast, but something about this passenger's calm demeanor made him especially nervous. Halfway up the aisle, an elderly gentleman stood up. "This isn't right," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "When did we become so afraid of a hat?" A few passengers nodded in agreement, while others rolled their eyes or looked away. Musk continued walking, seemingly unbothered, though his mind was racing. He was secretly recording everything on his phone, tucked casually in his pocket. This experiment had already revealed so much about human behavior, corporate culture, and the current state of society. As they approached the front of the plane, a businesswoman in first class spoke up. "I hope you're happy," she said to the flight attendant, "making us all late over a piece of clothing." The comment sparked a new wave of murmurs through the cabin. The flight attendant felt his professional mask slipping slightly. In all his years of service, he'd never felt quite so torn about following protocol. The passenger had been nothing but polite, and yet here they were, creating a scene that would probably end up viral on social media. Just then, the cockpit door opened. The pilot stepped out to check on the commotion, as was standard procedure during a passenger removal. His eyes scanned the situation, moving from the flight attendant to the passenger in question. The pilot's face froze. His eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. 20 years of professional composure crumbled in an instant as he recognized exactly who was being kicked off the plane. Mr. Musk, the pilot stammered, forgetting protocol entirely. The word rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers who had been recording lowered their phones in disbelief. Those who had been demanding his removal suddenly found their seats incredibly interesting. The head flight attendant's face drained of color. His legs felt weak as the realization hit him. He had just attempted to remove the owner of the airline from his own aircraft. His mind raced through his retirement plans, wondering if he'd be able to find work as a bus driver. A passenger who had been particularly vocal about removing Musk suddenly became very interested in the safety card in their seat pocket. Another person whispered, "Oh my God," so loudly it was hardly a whisper at all. Musk turned to face the cabin, still wearing the MAGA hat. The small smile on his face wasn't mocking or angry. If anything, it looked thoughtful. He pulled out his phone, stopped the recording, and glanced at the time. The entire cabin held its breath, waiting for the explosion, the firing, the anger that surely must come from a billionaire who had just been asked to leave his own plane. The tension was so thick you could hear the air conditioning humming. But what happened next would change not just the lives of everyone on that plane, but the way people thought about leadership, social experiments, and the complex dance between policy and common sense. The silence in the cabin was deafening. The pilot stood frozen, his hand still on the cockpit door. The head flight attendant looked like he might faint, his face as white as the clouds outside. Every passenger sat perfectly still, as if movement might somehow make the situation even more awkward than it already was. Musk broke into a warm smile, surprising everyone. "Well," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin, "this has been quite educational." He turned to the head flight attendant, who looked like he was mentally updating his resume. "Sir, I had no idea," the flight attendant stammered, his professional demeanor cracking completely. "I was just following our protocol, not potentially disruptive." His voice trailed off as he realized he was explaining company policy to the person who probably wrote it. The young boy who had questioned Musk's removal earlier spoke up again. "Mom, isn't that the space rocket guy?" His innocent question broke the tension, causing several passengers to laugh nervously. Musk walked back down the aisle, this time with the pilot and flight attendant following him like confused ducklings. The passengers who had been so vocal about removing him suddenly found their phones, magazines, and even air sickness bags fascinating. "Everyone, may I have your attention?" Musk's voice was gentle but carried authority. The passengers who had been pretending to be invisible now looked up, curiosity overcoming their embarrassment. Today wasn't about a hat, he continued, gesturing to the MAGA cap he was still wearing. It was about seeing how our airline really operates when nobody knows who's watching. He paused, letting his words sink in. The businesswoman who had complained earlier raised her hand slightly, like a student in class. Are we all going to be in your next Twitter post?" Her voice wavered between fear and hope. Musk chuckled. "No, this isn't about public shaming. It's about learning." He turned to the head flight attendant, who looked like he was calculating how many months of savings he had left. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You followed protocol, remained professional, and put the comfort of all passengers first." The relief on the flight attendant's face was visible from every seat in the cabin. A few passengers started to nod, beginning to understand what they had just been part of. The older gentleman who had defended Musk earlier spoke up, so this was all a test. His voice carried a mix of admiration and disbelief. "More an experiment," Musk replied. "Sometimes the only way to really understand something is to experience it from the ground up." He looked around the cabin, making eye contact with various passengers. "And you've all helped me learn something valuable today." The tension in the cabin had transformed into something else, a kind of shared excitement, as if everyone had just become part of an exclusive club. Phones were coming out again, but this time not to record conflict, but to capture this unusual moment. The pilot, who had been quietly watching, finally found his voice. Should we prepare for takeoff, sir?" he asked, still sounding unsure about the protocol for this unprecedented situation. Musk grinned. "Absolutely. I believe we're all going to have a very interesting flight to Texas." He turned to address the cabin one last time. "And I think we've all learned something about judging situations and people at face value." As he walked back to his seat, the whole atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The same passengers who had been divided just minutes ago were now chatting excitedly with each other, bound together by this bizarre shared experience. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, phones throughout the cabin were buzzing with notifications. Despite Musk's assurance that he wouldn't post about the incident, passengers' social media posts were spreading like wildfire. #Planagate and #UndercoverBoss were already trending. The head flight attendant, now much more relaxed, was serving drinks in first class when Musk waved him over. "Could you gather your crew for a moment?" he asked. "I'd like to have a quick chat." The flight attendant nodded, still looking slightly nervous despite the earlier reassurance. Within minutes, the cabin crew huddled near the front galley. The young flight attendant who had first noticed the tension was fidgeting with her scarf again, but this time from excitement rather than anxiety. First, Musk began, "I want to thank you all. Today showed me something important about our company." He paused, looking at each crew member. "You didn't give special treatment. You didn't bend rules. You treated everyone equally, even when that someone was me." A passenger sitting nearby pulled out his earbuds to listen. Soon, others were doing the same, the movie screens forgotten as the real entertainment unfolded in the aisle. But, Musk continued, "It also showed me something else. Maybe some of our policies need a second look. Maybe we're letting fear drive too many of our decisions." The crew members exchanged glances, realizing they were part of something bigger than a simple flight incident. The businesswoman who had complained earlier raised her hand again. "Mr. Musk." When he turned, she looked embarrassed but determined. "I think I owe you an apology. I was quick to judge, and, well, I was wrong." Her words seemed to open a floodgate. Other passengers started sharing their thoughts. The elderly gentleman talked about how divided society had become. The young boy's mother discussed how hard it was to explain today's world to children. Even the college students who had been filming everything put down their phones to join the conversation. Meanwhile, social media was exploding. News outlets were picking up the story. Breaking. Billionaire kicked off his own plane. Read one headline. Musk's undercover boss moment goes viral, declared another. The head flight attendant's phone buzzed with a message from his supervisor. "Just saw the news. Are you okay?" He smiled, realizing how different this day had turned out from what he'd feared. Musk pulled out his laptop and started typing. "I think," he said to no one in particular, "it's time for a company-wide memo." The passengers nearby tried to peek at his screen, curious about what changes this unusual flight might bring. A flight attendant serving drinks in economy class was stopped every few steps by passengers wanting to share their take on what had happened. The plane had become a flying focus group, with everyone eager to contribute their thoughts on company policy, social issues, and leadership. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unusual social media turbulence." A ripple of laughter spread through the cabin. "But our flight is proceeding normally to Texas. Though I must say, this is one flight I'll never forget." As they flew over the Midwest, Musk continued typing his memo, occasionally looking up to observe the conversations happening around him. The same cabin that had been divided an hour ago was now united in discussion, debate, and even laughter. The young flight attendant who had first noticed the tension walked past Musk's seat. She had a question that had been bothering her. "Sir," she said quietly, "did you plan this all alone?" Musk looked up from his laptop with a slight smile, and his answer would give everyone something to think about for a long time to come. 1 week after the famous flight, the airline's headquarters was buzzing with activity. The viral story had sparked thousands of conversations about leadership, company culture, and the balance between rules and common sense. The video clips had been viewed millions of times, turning the flight crew into minor celebrities. The head flight attendant sat nervously in the main conference room. A week ago, he thought he'd lost his job. Now, he was about to lead a training session on what the company was calling the hat incident. His hands shook slightly as he arranged his notes. "Ready?" Musk poked his head through the door, still wearing the same MAGA hat, though now it carried a different meaning, less about politics and more about the lesson it had taught. The flight attendant nodded, amazed at how much had changed in just 7 days. The room filled quickly. Airline staff from across the country had flown in for this special training session. Some were taking selfies with the now famous crew members. Others were discussing the new company policies that had emerged from that unexpected flight. Last week, the head flight attendant began, his voice stronger than he expected. "I tried to kick our CEO off his own plane." Laughter filled the room. But what happened next changed how we think about everything. On the screen behind him, clips from the flight played. The initial tension, the confrontation, the revelation, and most importantly, the conversations that followed. Each moment now served as a teaching tool. Musk stepped forward. "When that street vendor gave me this hat, I had no plan," he admitted. But sometimes the best lessons come from unplanned moments. He glanced at his phone, where #TheIncident was still trending. We learned that good leadership isn't about forcing people to follow rules blindly. It's about understanding why those rules exist. The young flight attendant who first noticed the tension raised her hand. "What about the new training program?" she asked. The past week had seen huge changes in company policy, with a focus on handling sensitive situations with more flexibility and understanding. "That's why you're all here," Musk replied. "We're not just changing rules. We're changing how we think about them." He gestured to the head flight attendant. And who better to lead this training than someone who stood up for what he thought was right, even to his boss? The crew from that famous flight had all been promoted. Not as a reward for their mistake, but for their professionalism in handling it. Their story had become a case study in corporate training programs across the country. The elderly passenger who had defended Musk appeared in the next video clip, interviewed on national news. "It wasn't just about a hat," he said. "It was about how we treat each other when we think no one important is watching." As the training session continued, stories poured in from other flights, other crews, and other passengers. Each one added to the larger lesson about leadership, humanity, and the importance of thinking beyond rigid rules. The final slide showed a simple message. Every passenger is the owner of this airline. Below it, a photo of Musk in economy class, still wearing his hat, smiling at the camera. The image had become a symbol of hands-on leadership and the power of walking in someone else's shoes. "So," Musk concluded, looking around the room, "who's ready to rethink everything they know about customer service?" Hands shot up across the room. The hat incident had started as an accidental experiment, but had transformed into something much bigger. A revolution in how companies think about policies, people, and the delicate balance between rules and reality. As the session ended, the head flight attendant picked up the hat Musk had left on the podium. "Should I put this in the company museum?" he asked with a grin. Musk shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "Sometimes the best reminders of our biggest lessons are the simplest ones."